boy was Marcus Chen, a foster kid who Sergeant Martinez had mentored before deploying overseas. The shout of "loser" was their secret code, a way for Marcus to identify himself if they ever met again. What happened when these two reunited would reveal a story of brotherhood, promise-keeping, and the life-changing power of one soldier's compassion.
Before we reveal the heartbreaking backstory behind this boy's insult and why the tomb guard's response brought hundreds to tears, tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
If stories of unexpected connections, kept promises, and the bonds that transcend duty move your heart, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another powerful story about heroes who never forget the people they've helped. The November afternoon was unseasonably warm at Arlington National Cemetery, drawing larger crowds than typical for a weekday. Among the visitors gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony stood a teenage boy who radiated hostility and disconnection. 15-year-old Marcus Chen slouched against the rope barrier with his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn hoodie, his face set in the hardened expression that foster kids often develop as armor against a world that has repeatedly let them down. Marcus hadn't wanted to come to Arlington. His current foster parents, the Johnsons, had insisted on the visit as part of what they called cultural education for their 3 foster children. Marcus had learned over his 10 years in the system that such outings were usually more about the foster parents feeling good about themselves than about any genuine care for the kids. He'd been in 7 different homes since his mother's overdose when he was 5, and he'd learned not to trust anyone's motives or promises. But there was something else driving Marcus's presence at the tomb today. Something the Johnsons didn't know about and wouldn't have understood. 5 years ago, in a different life that felt like a different person, Marcus had met someone who had actually kept a promise. The memory of that person was the only thing that had kept Marcus from completely giving up on humanity. And today was about honoring that memory in the only way Marcus knew how. Sergeant David Martinez had been walking his watch at the tomb of the unknown soldier for 42 minutes when he became aware of the troubled teenager at the rope barrier. At 32 years old, Martinez was a decorated combat veteran with tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan before earning the honor of serving as a tomb guard. The selection had come after years of exemplary service and months of intensive training that pushed soldiers to their physical and mental limits. His dark blue dress uniform with its distinctive red stripe was immaculate, white gloves spotless despite the afternoon humidity, mirror-polished shoes reflecting the autumn sun. The M14 rifle he carried gleamed with meticulous care, every surface treated with the reverence due to an instrument of sacred duty. His movements were mechanical perfection. 21 measured steps, turn, face the tomb for 21 seconds, turn again, march back. The routine had continued unbroken through every weather condition and challenge for nearly a century. But Martinez's training included more than ceremonial precision. Combat experience had taught him to read body language, to assess potential threats, to recognize when someone's hostility masked something deeper. The teenager at the barrier interested him in a way he couldn't quite identify. There was something in the boy's posture, the set of his jaw, the intensity of his observation that felt familiar even through the apparent disrespect. The crowd around Marcus was typical for Arlington. Families on educational trips, international tourists, veterans paying respects, school groups learning about military tradition. Most visitors maintained appropriate reverence for the sacred ground, but there were always a few who struggled with the concept of respectful silence. The Johnsons' other 2 foster children, younger than Marcus, watched the ceremony with genuine interest, while their foster parents alternated between observing the guard and checking their phones. Marcus's social worker had arranged this placement 6 months ago with optimistic talk about the Johnsons being experienced foster parents who specialized in difficult teens. Marcus had heard similar promises before and had learned to trust only what he could verify through experience. The Johnsons were better than some homes he'd been in. They didn't hit him, the food was adequate, and they mostly left him alone. But they also made clear that his presence was temporary, that they were doing their civic duty, and that gratitude was expected for the basics of survival. What the social worker, the Johnsons, and everyone else in Marcus's current life didn't know was that 5 years ago, Before, multiple failed placements and accumulated trauma had hardened him into the hostile teenager standing at the rope barrier. Marcus had encountered someone who had actually seen him as a human being rather than a problem to be managed or a check from social services. It had been during a community outreach program at Fort Myer, adjacent to Arlington Cemetery. Then, Sergeant Martinez, between combat deployments, had volunteered with a program that brought at-risk youth to interact with soldiers and learn about military values. 10-year-old Marcus, fresh from another failed placement and acting out in predictable ways, had been dragged to the program by a foster parent who hoped military discipline might straighten him out. Most of the soldiers had treated the kids with professional courtesy but obvious discomfort with their emotional problems and behavioral issues. Martinez had been different. He had seen past Marcus's defensive hostility to the frightened, abandoned child beneath. Over the 6-week program, Martinez had made a point of connecting with Marcus, listening to his story without judgment, treating him with respect that the boy had rarely experienced. On the program's final day, Martinez had pulled Marcus aside and made him a promise that the cynical 10-year-old had initially dismissed as another adult lie. He said that if Marcus ever needed him, if he was ever in trouble or just needed someone who remembered who he really was beneath all the armor, he could find Martinez. And because Marcus wouldn't remember his name or know how to reach him, Martinez taught him a code word, a word that sounded like an insult but was actually their private signal for "I need help" or "I remember you." That word was loser. Marcus had carried that promise through 5 more foster placements, 3 schools, countless disappointments, and the slow hardening of his heart against hope. But he had never forgotten, and he had never stopped believing that somewhere out there was one person who had actually meant what he said. When Marcus learned that Martinez had completed his combat tours and was serving as a tomb guard at Arlington, it had felt like fate providing one final chance to test whether any adult's promise could be trusted. Now, as Martinez completed another turn and began marching toward the section where Marcus stood, the teenager felt his heart pounding. This was the moment. Either Martinez would remember and honor his promise, or Marcus would have final confirmation that even the best adults eventually proved to be liars. His hands clenched in his hoodie pockets as he prepared to shout the word that would determine whether hope was worth holding on to as Sergeant Martinez reached the point in his ceremonial march closest to where Marcus stood at the rope barrier. The teenager took a deep breath and shouted with all the pent-up emotion of 5 years of abandonment and desperate hope. "Hey, loser!" The effect on the crowd was immediate and visceral. Heads whipped toward Marcus, faces showing shock and outrage. Parents pulled their children closer, as if proximity to such disrespect might contaminate. Veterans in the crowd stiffened with anger, some beginning to move toward the boy to deliver verbal corrections about appropriate behavior at a military shrine. The Johnsons' faces flushed with embarrassment and fury. Mrs. Johnson's hand reaching to grab Marcus's arm and drag him away from the scene he was creating for Martinez. The word hit like a physical blow, not from offense but from recognition. His step faltered for a microsecond, barely perceptible to anyone not trained to notice such things. But in that microsecond, 5 years collapsed. He was back at Fort Myer, looking into the eyes of a 10-year-old boy who had been failed by every adult he'd ever known, making a promise that he'd meant with every fiber of his being but never thought would be tested. The protocol was absolute. The tomb guard never broke formation, never acknowledged individual visitors, never allowed personal recognition to interfere with the eternal watch. Martinez had executed this watch hundreds of times through weather emergencies, security threats, and countless distractions. His training demanded he continue his march, ignore the outburst, let cemetery staff handle the disruptive visitor. But this wasn't disruption. This was a promise being called in, a code word being used exactly as he'd taught it to be used. Somewhere in that crowd was the boy he'd once helped, now a teenager testing whether any adult could be trusted to keep their word. And Martinez understood with crystal clarity that his response in the next few seconds would either validate or destroy whatever fragile. Martinez made a decision that would require explanation to his commanding officers and might cost him his position as a tomb guard. He stopped his march mid-stride. The crowd's murmurs grew louder at this unprecedented break in routine. He executed a precise facing movement, not toward the tomb, but toward the rope barrier, where Marcus stood frozen, his defiant expression beginning to crack under the weight of what he was seeing. Martinez walked directly toward the barrier with measured military bearing, his face showing no anger but intense focus. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path between the guard and the teenage boy. Mrs. Johnson had grabbed Marcus's arm and was attempting to pull him away, apologizing profusely to nearby visitors about her troubled foster child. But Marcus stood his ground, his eyes locked on Martinez, with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. As Martinez reached the rope barrier, he stopped exactly 1 pace away and came to attention. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the plaza with the same projection he used for security warnings, but the tone was entirely different. Warm, certain, filled with recognition and validation. He addressed Marcus by name, the name he remembered from 5 years ago when a frightened 10-year-old had reluctantly shared it during their first conversation at the community program. He said he had made a promise to that boy. That promises mattered more than protocol, and that he wanted Marcus to know that he had remembered every single day for 5 years. The effect on Marcus was immediate and overwhelming. The hardened expression that had been his armor for years crumbled. Tears began streaming down his face as 5 years of suppressed hope and grief and loneliness erupted in sobs he couldn't control. His knees buckled, and he would have collapsed if Martinez hadn't reached across the barrier to steady him with strong, certain hands that promised this was real. This was happening. Someone had actually kept their word. Mrs. Johnson stood frozen. In shock, her hand still on Marcus's arm, but her grip loosening as she struggled to understand what was unfolding. The crowd's anger transformed into confused curiosity and then growing emotional recognition. This wasn't a disrespectful teenager mocking a ceremony. This was something far more complex and meaningful. Martinez continued speaking quietly to Marcus, his words intended only for the boy but loud enough that nearby observers caught fragments. He explained that he had hoped Marcus would find him someday, that he had prayed the boy was okay, that the promise had never been empty words, but a commitment Martinez had carried through 2 combat tours and every day of his service at Arlington. Marcus, still crying but trying desperately to compose himself, as he'd been taught to do in a system that punished emotional vulnerability, managed to choke out questions through his tears. Had Martinez really remembered? Had he really meant it? Was this real, or would it turn out to be another cruel disappointment like all the others? Martinez's response was to do something that would require extensive explanation to his chain of command, but that he knew was the only appropriate action. He removed his white gloves, a gesture that marked the transition from ceremonial soldier to individual human being. He pulled a card from his uniform pocket, a card he'd carried every day for 5 years, updating his contact information each time it changed, hoping against hope that the angry, abandoned boy he'd tried to help would someday feel safe enough to reach out. He pressed the card into Marcus's trembling hand and made a new promise, right there in front of hundreds of witnesses. He promised that Marcus was no longer alone, that he had someone who remembered him and cared about what happened to him, and that this wasn't goodbye but the beginning of Marcus having someone permanent in his life who would never give up on him. As Marcus clutched the card with Martinez's contact information, struggling to believe this was actually happening, cemetery security and Arlington's commanding officers were converging on the scene. They had monitored the interaction via security cameras and were prepared for multiple scenarios: confrontation, security threat, public disturbance requiring intervention. What they found instead was a tomb guard standing at the rope barrier with tears in his own eyes, comforting a sobbing teenager, while hundreds of visitors watched with growing emotional understanding. The relief commander approached Martinez with professional bearing but obvious concern about the protocol violation. Before he could speak, however, Martinez stood to attention and provided a concise explanation that would sound impossibly improbable if not for the dozens of witnesses who could verify at least the emotional truth of what had occurred. He explained about the community outreach program 5 years ago, The promise made to a troubled 10-year-old, the code word that served as their private signal, and the boy's use of that code word to identify himself and call in the promise. Mrs. Johnson, still processing the scene, attempted to assert control over her foster child by insisting Marcus needed to leave immediately and would be disciplined for his disrespectful behavior. But Martinez politely and firmly explained to her and the growing crowd that Marcus's shout had not been disrespect, but rather the proper use of an agreed-upon signal, that the boy had done exactly what he'd been taught to do if he ever needed help, and that the insult was actually an act of trust and courage. The relief commander, a veteran himself with 20 years of service, faced a decision that would be reviewed and discussed in military circles for years to come. Protocol had been violated, but the circumstances were extraordinary. A soldier had kept a promise to a vulnerable child across 5 years and 2 combat tours. A foster kid in desperate need of stability had reached out in the only way he knew how. And now, hundreds of visitors were witnessing something that, while unprecedented, spoke to values the military claimed to uphold. After a moment of consideration, the relief commander made an announcement to the gathered crowd. He explained that what they had witnessed was not a protocol violation, but a demonstration of what military service was really about: keeping promises, protecting the vulnerable, and remembering that the duty to serve extended beyond ceremony to actual human connection. He asked visitors to understand that while Sergeant Martinez would be relieved from his current watch shift to address this situation, the ceremony would continue and should be treated with appropriate respect. What the relief commander didn't mention immediately, but would become clear in subsequent hours, was that Martinez's actions would be reviewed by the chain of command, possibly costing him his position as a tomb guard. The protocols governing the watch were not merely traditional, but were considered essential to maintaining the sacred nature of the duty. Exceptions, even for compassionate reasons, set precedents that could undermine the institution. But as the relief commander watched Marcus Chen, a 15-year-old foster kid who had been failed by system after system, clutch a card that represented perhaps his first real hope in 5 years, he understood that some moments transcended protocol. Military values included duty and honor, but they also included loyalty and commitment to those you'd sworn to protect. Martinez had sworn to protect a vulnerable 10-year-old, and he was keeping that oath even at potential cost to his career. Martinez was permitted to step away from his post to speak more privately with Marcus and the Johnsons. In a quiet area, away from the main crowds, the full story began to emerge. Marcus explained through continued tears about the 10 foster homes, the accumulating trauma, the way he'd hardened himself against hope until remembering Martinez's promise was the only thing that kept him from completely giving up. He described how he'd researched online to learn that Martinez was serving at Arlington, how he'd convinced the Johnsons to bring him there with a cover story about wanting to learn about military history, how terrified he'd been that the promise would prove to be another lie. The Johnsons, to their credit, began to understand the inadequacy of their approach to foster care. They had provided physical necessities and followed regulations, but they had never truly seen Marcus as anything but a temporary responsibility. Watching this soldier, who had no legal obligation, no family connection, no systemic requirement to remember a troubled kid from a brief program, demonstrate such complete commitment forced them to reconsider what foster parenting actually required. Martinez, for his part, was already making plans. He contacted his social worker contacts from his community outreach days, began navigating the process of becoming a mentor within the foster system, explored options for providing Marcus with stability, even though he couldn't serve as a foster parent himself while on active duty. The promise had been to be there for Marcus if he ever needed help, and Martinez took that promise seriously enough to restructure his personal life to honor it. The story could have ended there. A touching moment, a promise kept, a troubled teen given hope. But what happened in the weeks that followed would demonstrate that Martinez's commitment went far beyond a single emotional reunion and would ultimately transform not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless other foster children who needed someone to believe in them. In the immediate aftermath of the Arlington encounter, Martinez faced his chain of command review. The investigation was thorough, examining whether his protocol break had been justified and what precedent it might set for future Tomb Guard conduct. Character witnesses included the relief commander who had been on duty that day, fellow Tomb Guards who spoke to Martinez's dedication and professionalism, and officers from the community outreach program who verified the backstory about the promise made to 10-year-old Marcus. The decision that came down from command was nuanced and thoughtful. Martinez would not face disciplinary action, but his protocol break would be noted in his record as an extraordinary circumstance that should not be considered precedent for future deviations. More importantly, the command recognized that Martinez's actions had demonstrated core military values of loyalty and commitment to protecting the vulnerable. He would complete his remaining time as a Tomb Guard, with the understanding that while rules were important, the values those rules served sometimes required wisdom rather than rigidity. But the more profound impact was on Marcus Chen and the foster care system he represented. Video footage of the encounter, the boy shouting "loser," the guard's unprecedented response, the emotional reunion, had gone viral within hours. News organizations picked up the story, initially framing it as a heartwarming moment, but gradually discovering the deeper narrative about foster care failure, the need for consistent adult presence in vulnerable children's lives, and one soldier's extraordinary commitment to a promise made during a 6-week program. The attention forced uncomfortable conversations about foster care in America. Statistics about the number of placements average foster children experienced, the high rates of homelessness and incarceration among aged-out foster youth, the desperate need for consistent mentorship and adult support. Marcus's story became a catalyst for discussing what vulnerable children actually needed versus what the system typically provided. Martinez used his unexpected platform to advocate for changes in how military community outreach programs operated. He argued that 6-week programs with no follow-up were insufficient, that soldiers who connected with at-risk youth should be supported in maintaining those relationships long-term, and that the military's values of never leaving a soldier behind should extend to the vulnerable children service members encountered in their communities. Within 6 months, Martinez had partnered with foster care organizations and military family support services to create a formal mentorship program. It paired active duty and veteran service members with foster youth, providing structure and support for maintaining those relationships across deployments and transfers. The program included training on trauma-informed care, resources for navigating the foster system, and commitment to staying connected with assigned youth regardless of geographic separation. Marcus Chen, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that surprised everyone except Martinez. With consistent support from someone who genuinely cared about his well-being and future, Marcus's defensive hostility began to soften. His grades improved as he started to believe education might actually lead somewhere worth going. He participated in therapy that the Johnsons arranged, but that only worked because Marcus now had reason to hope that healing was possible. The Johnsons themselves underwent transformation. Watching Martinez's commitment to Marcus, making time for weekly video calls during his demanding duty schedule, visiting when possible, advocating for Marcus's needs with social workers, forced them to reconsider their approach to foster parenting. They began treating Marcus not as a temporary responsibility, but as a young person deserving of genuine investment and care. Their relationship didn't become perfect, but it became more authentic and supportive. As Martinez completed his service as a Tomb Guard and transitioned to other military assignments, his connection with Marcus remained constant. They navigated Marcus's 16th birthday together, discussed college options, worked through the trauma that still emerged in unexpected ways. Martinez attended Marcus's high school graduation, the first non-system adult who had ever witnessed a major milestone in the teenager's life. The story of their reunion at Arlington became something discussed in military leadership courses as an example of how keeping commitments and honoring promises transcended protocol and procedure. It appeared in social work training as a case study in the power of consistent adult presence in foster children's lives. It was shared in foster parent orientations as a reminder that the children they cared for desperately needed adults who would remember them, believe in them, and show up for them long after the system moved them along. Years later, When Marcus aged out of foster care at 18, he didn't become another statistic of homelessness or incarceration. He had stable housing, college enrollment, and perhaps most importantly, an adult in his life who had proven through years of consistent presence that promises could be kept and trust could be earned. Martinez attended his college graduation, watched him begin his career, and eventually stood beside him at his wedding. The shouted word "loser" at Arlington Cemetery, which had seemed like disrespect to hundreds of witnesses, turned out to be the opposite. It was a desperate act of hope, a test of whether any promise could be trusted, and ultimately the beginning of a mentorship that would ripple outward to touch thousands of foster children who learned that somewhere out there were adults who might actually mean it when they said they cared. The tomb guard's duty was to honor the fallen and protect the eternal watch. Sergeant David Martinez had done that while also honoring a promise to a vulnerable child, proving that military values and human compassion weren't contradictory but complementary, and demonstrating that sometimes the most important battles we fight are not in distant war zones but in the hearts and lives of children who need someone to believe in them when they've lost the ability to believe in themselves.